The vote had already happened before I understood what was being taken. I sat in my usual seat near the back curve of the council chamber, half listening, half reviewing a stack of border reports, when the tally lights above the human delegation flickered from blue to red. Nobody gasped. Nobody protested. The chamber simply moved on to the next item on the agenda, as if a species had not just lost an entire system in the space of 4 seconds. My name is Ordun Thay, and at the time, I served as a senior archivist for the Council of Bound Worlds. My work was quiet and unremarkable. I logged treaties. I cross-checked border claims. I filed disputes into neat folders that almost nobody ever reopened. I was, by every measure that mattered to me then, a careful and unimportant person, and I liked it that way. That day, the unimportant thing I witnessed was the reclassification of Kesh Hollow, a border system belonging to the human delegation, from protected territory to unclaimed space. The justification cited a wording error in the original settlement treaty, a technical gap between 2 clauses that nobody outside the Council's legal office would ever have noticed. I had reviewed that treaty myself, months earlier, during the human species provisional entry proceedings. I remembered thinking, even then, that the gap seemed unusually convenient. I did not think much more about it. Provisional members lost small pieces of territory to reclassification disputes fairly often. It was one of the quiet costs of joining a body as old and as crowded as ours. Older species had learned over centuries how to protect their borders from this kind of erosion. Newer ones had not yet learned the game. Humanity was new. Humanity, as far as most of the chamber was concerned, barely counted as a species worth taking seriously at all. I want to be honest about how we saw them, because it matters for everything that follows. Humans had been part of the Council for less than 4 standard years. Their homeworld was small. Their lifespans were short, barely a fraction of a typical Council delegate's. Their technology, while advancing at a pace some analysts found mildly interesting, was still considered several tiers below the established powers. Most delegates viewed their admission into the Council as a courtesy extended to a species that had, against long odds, managed to reach the stars without destroying itself first. We placed them in the outer ring of the chamber, a seating arrangement historically reserved for observer species who had not yet earned full voting privileges, even though humanity technically held one. We assigned them a rotating panel of cultural advisors, ostensibly to help them navigate Council procedure, though everyone understood the advisors' real purpose was to monitor and, when necessary, quietly steer their votes. Their translated documents arrived to other delegations riddled with small inconsistencies that the human interpreters never seemed to catch quickly enough to matter. None of this was cruelty in the way my own species understood cruelty. We do not raise weapons against each other inside these walls. Our unfairness was administrative. It lived in footnotes and technicalities and seating charts. It was, in its own way, more efficient than open conflict, because nobody could ever be blamed for it directly. I remember the human ambassador's face on the day Kesh Hollow was reclassified. Her name was Grace Whitmore, a woman of perhaps 45 years by human counting, though I had learned enough of their biology by then to know that number meant something different to them than it would to me. She did not look toward the vote counter. She did not look toward the delegates who had authored the wording gap. She simply turned to the small human contingent seated behind her, said something too quiet for the chamber translators to catch, and returned her attention to the notes in front of her. I assumed, at the time, that this was resignation. I assumed she understood there was nothing to be done, and that humans, whatever their other qualities, knew how to accept a loss gracefully. I filed the reclassification into my archive that evening, without a second thought, alongside 40 other administrative actions from the same session. It would be some time before I understood that I had misread her completely. To explain what happened next, I need to describe what the human delegation had actually been doing during their 4 years among us, because almost none of it appeared in any official record, and almost none of the chamber understood its value until it began to disappear. Humans, it turned out, were relentless builders of small, unglamorous systems. While older species jockeyed for prestige seats and ceremonial titles, the human delegation had spent its limited political capital establishing something the Council had never quite managed on its own, a functioning logistics network that connected supply routes across dozens of member systems, cutting transit times for medical shipments, disaster relief, and colonial resupply by significant margins. They had not asked for credit. They had not demanded a formal charter. They had simply built it, system by system, because the need was there, and because, as I would later learn, humans found unsolved logistical problems, almost unbearable to look at directly. They had also become, without any formal appointment, the preferred mediators in a string of quiet disputes between older rival species who had spent centuries unable to speak to each other without a translator loaded with historical grievance protocols. The human delegation had no ancient rivalries with anyone, no inherited resentments, no centuries-old border disagreements to avenge. This made them, oddly, the only party in the entire council that every other side could talk to without flinching. Ambassador Whitmore herself had personally sat through 11 separate resource disputes between two long-standing rival species, listening for hours at a stretch, asking careful questions, and somehow guiding both sides toward language they could both accept. None of this appeared as a formal council function. It was simply something humans did, quietly, in side rooms, because they had noticed the gap and decided to fill it. I had heard whispers of this work before, in passing conversations with colleagues from the logistics office, but I had never truly registered its scale. To me, humans were simply the newest arrivals, the smallest voice in a very large chamber, tolerated more than respected. It did not occur to me that the tolerance ran in both directions, and that we depended on them for things we had never bothered to formalize. The day after the Kesh Hollow vote, I noticed something strange in the transit logs I reviewed, as part of my normal duties. 3 human supply vessels that had been scheduled to route through the 11th corridor, carrying medical equipment bound for a border colony belonging to another species entirely, had been recalled. Not delayed, not rerouted, recalled, quietly, back toward human space. I assumed it was an isolated logistical hiccup. I flagged it for review and moved on with my day. 2 days after that, I received a notice that the human delegation's mediation office, the small unofficial room where so many disputes had been quietly resolved over the past years, had suspended all further sessions until further notice. The 2 species who had been mid-negotiation over a contested asteroid belt, a dispute that had nearly reignited old hostilities twice already, were informed that their session was cancelled, with no rescheduled date offered. I began to feel, for the first time, a small and specific unease. Not because I understood what was happening. I did not yet. It was more instinctive than that, the way one notices a familiar sound has stopped, without immediately realizing what the sound had been. I brought my concerns to my supervisor, a senior administrator named Peter Lang, who had overseen the archive office for longer than I had been alive. He listened to my report with the mild patience of someone who had seen many junior archivists mistake minor administrative shifts for something larger than they were. "Ordune," he said, "species recall assets after unfavorable votes all the time. It is a common diplomatic gesture, a show of displeasure. It rarely lasts more than a season." I wanted to believe him. He had decades of experience, and I had 4 years. But something in the pattern nagged at me, a small persistent wrongness I could not name, and that evening, I did something I rarely did outside of official duty. I pulled the full record of human diplomatic activity across the Council's history, and began reading through it properly, not as an archivist cataloging entries, but as someone trying to understand a shape before it fully formed. What I found unsettled me more than I expected. Humanity had never, in 4 years, filed a formal grievance against the Council. Not once. They had absorbed dozens of minor slights, procedural rulings, and unfavorable outcomes without a single official complaint. Where other species would have escalated, filed counter-motions, or demanded arbitration, the human delegation had simply noted the outcome and continued their work. I had mistaken this pattern for passivity. Reading it again, laid end to end across 4 years, it did not look like passivity at all. It looked like patience being spent very carefully, and very deliberately, toward some threshold I could not yet see. I found something else too, buried in an old transcript from humanity's original entry proceedings, a session I had not been present for, but had access to through the archive. During the closing arguments for their provisional membership, one of the senior council delegates, a representative of an older and more established species, had asked Ambassador Whitmore directly what humanity intended to do if the Council's terms proved, in his words, less than fair. Her answer, recorded in the transcript, was short. "We do not intend to fight anyone here," she had said. "We only intend to be useful for as long as being useful makes sense to us." At the time, the chamber had apparently taken this as a diplomatic pleasantry, the kind of soft phrase new members offered to seem agreeable. Reading it again, alone in my office with the recalled supply log still open beside me, it read entirely differently. It read like a warning nobody had bothered to hear. I did not sleep well that night. I kept returning to that phrase, turning it over, trying to understand what "for as long as being useful makes sense to us" actually meant in practice. I had spent my career treating the Council as a fixed structure, a permanent architecture that species joined and adapted to, not something that depended on the quiet, unglamorous labor of any one member to keep functioning. It had never occurred to me that a foundation could simply choose to walk away from the building it was holding up. The following morning, I arrived at the archive office early, intending to file my concerns more formally, only to find the entire office in a state of low-grade confusion. A dispute resolution session scheduled for that day, between two mid-tier species over a shared mining route, had been cancelled because the human mediator originally assigned had not arrived, and no replacement had been sent. The Council's own scheduling office had apparently assumed this was an oversight and requested a new mediator be assigned. The request had gone unanswered. By midday, 3 more incidents had crossed my desk. A relay station in a border region, staffed jointly by human and Council technicians, had reported that its human staff had been recalled home, leaving the facility understaffed and its maintenance schedule immediately behind. A shipment of specialized medical supplies bound for a colony recovering from a recent famine had been rerouted back to human space without explanation, and the small human liaison office that had, for years, quietly handled translation disputes between 2 elder species, with famously incompatible legal traditions, had posted a simple notice on its door: "Closed until further notice." None of these actions were hostile. None of them broke any law or violated any treaty. Humanity had simply, quietly, without announcement or complaint, begun stepping back from every unofficial role they had ever filled. I brought this pattern to Peter Lang again, this time with the full weight of evidence laid out before him. He read through my notes slowly, his expression shifting from patient amusement to something more careful. "This is different," he admitted finally. "This is not a season of displeasure. This looks coordinated." I asked him what he thought it meant. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think," he said, "we may have just found out how much of this Council was never actually held together by us at all." I did not fully understand the size of what he meant until the following week, when the first real consequences began to surface, not in quiet administrative logs, but in places the entire chamber could no longer ignore. A dispute that the human delegation had been quietly managing between 2 elder rival species, over a contested resource corridor that had nearly caused open conflict twice in the past century, reignited within days of the Human Mediation Office closing its doors. Without the neutral, patient presence that had kept both sides talking for years, old accusations resurfaced almost immediately. Both delegations recalled their diplomatic staff from the shared negotiating table. Reports of armed posturing near the disputed corridor reached the chamber within the week. The Council convened an emergency session to address it. I sat in my usual seat, watching delegates who had, only weeks earlier, celebrated the reclassification of Kesh Hollow as a minor procedural victory, now scrambling to understand why a dispute they had assumed was permanently settled had suddenly become volatile again. Nobody, in that emergency session, mentioned the human delegation once. Nobody connected the closed mediation office to the reignited hostilities. It was as if the entire chamber had forgotten, in the space of a few weeks, that the peace they were now struggling to preserve had never truly been their own achievement to begin with. I sat there, quiet in my seat near the back curve of the chamber, and felt something settle in my chest that I would later come to understand as the earliest edge of regret. Not because I had personally voted for anything, or personally authored any insult against the human delegation. I had done nothing but file paperwork and read old transcripts. But I had watched it happen. I had seen the vote pass. I had seen Ambassador Whitmore's quiet, unreadable expression as the tally turned red, and I had assumed, as so many of us had assumed, that her silence meant she had nothing left to say. I was beginning to understand, slowly and with a growing unease I could not yet fully name, that her silence had never been an ending. It had been the opening move of something far larger, and the chamber had been too busy congratulating itself to notice the door quietly closing behind it. The emergency session over the reignited resource corridor dispute lasted 3 days, and by the end of it, I understood that something in the Council's basic assumptions had quietly broken. I want to describe those 3 days carefully, because they taught me more about how deeply we had come to rely on humanity than any report or archive record ever could. The two rival species at the center of the dispute, an older maritime civilization called the Threll Assembly, and a fiercely proud mining confederation known as the Carvex Union, had been circling this particular resource corridor for nearly 2 centuries. Before humanity's arrival, the corridor had triggered 3 serious confrontations, each one requiring years of council intervention to cool down. The most recent peace, brokered quietly by Ambassador Whitmore and her small mediation staff, had held for almost 3 years, longer than any previous arrangement in living memory. When the Human Mediation Office closed its doors without explanation, both the Threll and Carvex delegations initially assumed it was a temporary pause. Within a week, however, old suspicions resurfaced. The Threll Assembly accused the Carvex Union of quietly expanding mining operations past the agreed boundary. The Carvex Union accused the Threll of stationing additional vessels near the corridor under the guise of routine patrols. Neither accusation would have gained traction with a neutral party present to verify the facts. Without one, both sides retreated into old patterns of distrust that predated humanity's arrival by over a century. I watched, from my seat near the back of the chamber, as senior council delegates who had barely acknowledged humanity's existence a month earlier now scrambled to find any replacement mediator willing to step into the dispute. Nobody wanted the assignment. The Threll and Carvex delegations had a well-earned reputation for exhausting anyone who tried to referee them, and every experienced mediator in the chamber had learned, over the decades, to avoid volunteering. A senior delegate named Nathan Cole, representing one of the older founding species, and someone I had crossed paths with occasionally in procedural matters, finally rose during the second day of the emergency session and asked the question that had clearly been sitting, unspoken, in the minds of half the chamber. "Where is the human delegation?" he asked. "They handled this corridor for 3 years without a single incident. Why are we scrambling to find a replacement, instead of simply asking them to return to the table?" The silence that followed his question told me more than any answer could have. Several delegates shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances I recognized as discomfort disguised as patience. Finally, a representative from the Council's diplomatic office stood and explained, in careful and deliberately vague language, that the human delegation had informed the Council, through a brief written notice, that they were suspending all voluntary mediation services until further notice, and that no further explanation had been provided. Nathan Cole pressed further. "Voluntary," he repeated. "I was not aware any of this was ever formalized." The diplomatic representative admitted, with visible reluctance, that it had not been. None of the human delegation's mediation work had ever been written into any council charter. It had simply happened, quietly and consistently, for 3 years, without anyone thinking to formalize an arrangement that appeared to be working perfectly well on its own. I remember thinking, at that moment, how strange it was that an institution as old and as procedurally obsessed as the Council had allowed something so critical to its stability to exist entirely outside its own rules. We had thousands of pages of treaty language governing trade tariffs and border disputes and diplomatic protocol, and yet the single most effective peacekeeping mechanism in recent memory had never been written down anywhere at all. The emergency session eventually produced a temporary solution, a rotating panel of 3 delegates from neutral species, tasked with monitoring the corridor until a permanent mediator could be found. It was, by every account I later heard, a poor substitute. The panel lacked the trust both the Threll and Carvex delegations had slowly built with Ambassador Whitmore over 3 years of patient, careful work. Within 2 weeks, Minor skirmishing incidents near the corridor's edge had already been reported. Nothing severe enough to draw formal council intervention, but enough to remind everyone how quickly old wounds could reopen once the stitches were removed. I found myself, during this period, spending increasing amounts of my own time researching humanity's broader history, partly out of professional curiosity, and partly, I now admit, out of a growing personal unease I could not entirely explain to myself. I wanted to understand what kind of species could build so much quiet infrastructure without ever demanding recognition for it, and then dismantle all of it without a single public complaint. What I found, buried in older records from humanity's homeworld history, unsettled me in a different way than the immediate crisis had. Humanity's own history, before their arrival among the stars, was marked by long periods of internal conflict between their own nations and peoples. I had assumed, given how carefully they avoided confrontation within the council, that this history had been resolved through some form of enforced unity, a single governing structure that had eventually subdued the divisions. The records suggested something more complicated. Humanity's internal conflicts had not been resolved through domination. They had been resolved, slowly and imperfectly, through humans learning, at great cost to themselves, exactly how expensive open conflict truly was, and choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to build systems of cooperation instead. This detail struck me as important, though I could not yet articulate why. It suggested that humanity's restraint within the council was not a lack of capability or a lack of confidence. It was a chosen behavior, hard-won through their own difficult history, and deliberately extended to us as a kind of experiment. They had chosen, again and again, to be useful rather than dominant, and now, it seemed, that choice had quietly ended. I brought these findings to Peter Lang, hoping he might help me make sense of them. He listened carefully, as he always did, and then offered an observation that has stayed with me since. "We assumed their patience meant they had nothing better to do," he said. "It never occurred to us that patience might simply be a resource they were choosing to spend on us, the same way they spent fuel or supplies. And resources, once spent, do not replenish themselves for free." I asked him what he thought would happen next. He did not have a clear answer, and neither did I. But within days, the answer began to arrive on its own, delivered not through any dramatic announcement, but through the same quiet, procedural channels that had carried every other piece of this unfolding pattern. A formal notice appeared in the Council's diplomatic register, filed by the human delegation, informing all member species that human-owned relay stations across several border regions would be decommissioned over the following month, citing what the notice described only as a reallocation of resources toward domestic priorities. I read that notice 3 times before its full weight settled on me. Human relay stations had, for years, quietly extended the Council's communication network far beyond what our own infrastructure could reliably support, particularly in the outer border regions where older species had never found it cost-effective to maintain their own facilities. Their decommissioning would not simply inconvenience a handful of colonies. It would sever reliable communication for dozens of systems that had never bothered to build redundant infrastructure of their own, because humanity's network had always been there, quietly filling the gap. I brought this notice directly to the Council's infrastructure office, hoping someone there might already be preparing a contingency plan. What I found instead was something close to disbelief. The office's senior engineer, a meticulous woman named Laura Bennett who had overseen infrastructure coordination for over a decade, told me plainly that no contingency existed because nobody had ever anticipated humanity withdrawing support they had never been contractually obligated to provide in the first place.
"We built our long-term projections around their network without ever formally securing it," she admitted. "It seemed reliable enough that nobody thought to question it. I do not know how long it will take us to replace even a fraction of that capacity, and I do not know what happens to the colonies relying on it in the meantime."
I left her office with a growing, uncomfortable clarity settling over me. What had begun as a single unfavorable vote over a single border system was no longer an isolated incident. It was becoming a pattern, deliberate and expanding, touching every corner of the Council's daily function that humanity had quietly propped up without ever being asked to. I began to wonder, for the first time, what Ambassador Whitmore's original words truly meant. We only intend to be useful for as long as being useful makes sense to us. I understood now that the threshold she had spoken of, calmly and without threat, during those early proceedings years earlier, had finally been crossed. And the Council, so confident in its own permanence, had not even noticed it happening until the walls it depended on began, one by one, to walk quietly out the door. That evening, I requested access to the human delegation's public communications archive, hoping to find some clue as to what might come next. What I found instead was a short, simply worded statement, posted without fanfare to the delegation's official channel, addressed to no one in particular. We remain committed to our own colonies, our own people, and our own future, the statement read. We wish the Council well in managing the responsibilities we have, until now, chosen to help carry. There was no anger in the words, no demand, no ultimatum, just a quiet, final clarity that felt, to me, far more unsettling than any threat could have been. I did not yet know how far this withdrawal would extend, or how quickly its consequences would spread beyond a single corridor or a single relay network. But sitting alone in my office that night, reading and rereading that short, calm statement, I understood, perhaps for the first time, that we had spent 4 years mistaking humanity's patience for weakness and their silence for surrender, when in truth, it had always been something closer to a very long, very careful countdown. The formal notice regarding Kesh Hollow arrived on my desk exactly 9 days after the reclassification vote, and it was this document, more than anything else, that finally revealed the shape of what humanity had been planning all along. I had expected, given everything I had already witnessed, some kind of protest or appeal from the human delegation regarding the loss of their border system. Instead, the notice was a simple acknowledgement. It confirmed, in plain administrative language, that the human delegation accepted the Council's ruling on Kesh Hollow, would not contest the reclassification through any further channel, and would begin an orderly transfer of remaining personnel and equipment from the system within 30 standard days. There was no anger in the document, no veiled threat, no request for reconsideration. It read exactly like every other administrative filing I had processed during my years at the archive, except for one detail buried in its closing paragraph, a detail I nearly missed on my first reading, and have not been able to stop thinking about since. The notice stated that, in accordance with what it called established precedent regarding voluntary services rendered outside of formal Council obligation, the human delegation would be treating the Kesh Hollow ruling as a broader indication of the Council's position on unformalized humanitarian and logistical support provided by member species. It went on to state that the human delegation would therefore be conducting a full review of all such support currently extended by humanity throughout Council space, to ensure such support remained, in the notice's careful phrasing, appropriately aligned with the Council's stated priorities. I read that paragraph perhaps a dozen times before I fully understood its implications. Humanity was not simply accepting a loss. They were treating that loss as evidence, formal and documented, that the Council did not value the informal contributions humanity had been making, and they intended to respond by systematically reviewing every single one of those contributions to decide whether continuing them still made sense. I brought the notice immediately to Peter Lang, who read it with the same careful attention he brought to every document, but this time his expression did not settle into patient reassurance. He set the notice down slowly and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "This is not an emotional reaction," he said finally. "This is a deliberate, structured response. They are treating our ruling as data, not insult, and that, Ordun, may be far more dangerous than if they were simply angry with us." I asked him what he meant, and he explained something that has shaped how I have understood humanity ever since. "Anger," he said, "burns hot and fades. It can be waited out, apologized to, redirected with enough patience and diplomacy. A calculated decision, made without emotion, based on evidence and precedent, does not fade the same way. It does not require an apology to resolve. It requires the underlying evidence to change, and evidence, once collected and reviewed, tends to be far harder to argue against than a grievance." I did not fully appreciate the weight of his words until 3 days later, when the first results of humanity's review began to surface. The Council received formal notice that human medical teams, who had for 2 years quietly staffed emergency relief efforts on a border colony recovering from a severe agricultural collapse, would be withdrawn within the month, with a brief explanation citing the review process referenced in the Kesh Hollow filing. The colony in question belonged to neither humans nor any species directly connected to humanity's founding treaties. It was a colony we, the wider council, had been slow to assist during the early stages of the crisis, arguing over resource allocation and jurisdictional responsibility for nearly 2 months before humanity had simply stepped in, unasked, and begun providing aid on their own initiative. I remember the reaction in the chamber when this notice was formally read aloud. For the first time since the crisis began, actual alarm spread visibly among several delegates, particularly those whose own colonies bordered similarly fragile systems that had, in one way or another, benefited from humanity's quiet generosity over the years. A delegate from a smaller, less established species, a soft-spoken representative named Owen Bishop, whose people had only joined the council a decade before humanity's own arrival, rose during the session and asked a question that I suspect many others in the chamber had been too proud to voice themselves. "Is there a way to appeal this review process?" he asked. "Is there a way to demonstrate that the council does, in fact, value the support humanity has provided?" The council's diplomatic office attempted to answer him, but the answer was thin and unconvincing even to my own ears. There was no formal appeal process, because there had never been a formal agreement to appeal against in the first place. Humanity's aid had always been voluntary. Its withdrawal, however uncomfortable, was equally voluntary, and entirely within their right. I watched Owen Bishop sit back down, his expression carrying the particular kind of frustration that comes from realizing, too late, that a safety net you never thought to acknowledge was never guaranteed to remain in place. Over the following 2 weeks, similar notices continued to arrive, each one delivered in the same calm, procedural language. Each one citing the same ongoing review. Human engineers withdrew from a joint terraforming project that had been quietly accelerating agricultural development on 3 separate border worlds. Human data analysts, who had for over a year been assisting the Council's own understaffed disaster prediction office with modeling severe weather patterns across dozens of colonies, ceased their contributions entirely, citing the same review process. A human-led initiative to standardize emergency medical protocols across incompatible species biologies, a project that had already saved lives on at least 2 occasions I was personally aware of through my archive work, was formally suspended pending, in the notice's words, further clarity regarding the Council's valuation of such efforts. None of these withdrawals broke any law, none of them violated any treaty. Each one arrived through the same quiet administrative channels I had spent my career working within, filed correctly, formatted properly, entirely within the bounds of what any species had every right to do with resources and labor that belonged to them and had never been formally promised to anyone else. And yet, system by system, the quiet architecture that had, without any of us fully realizing it, been holding much of the Council's daily function together, was being methodically dismantled, not through anger, not through retaliation, but through a calm, careful, evidence-based review that treated the Council's own dismissive ruling as the only data point it needed to justify a complete reassessment of everything humanity had ever chosen to give. I began, during this period, to feel something I had not expected to feel toward a species I had, until recently, considered largely beneath serious consideration. I began to feel a kind of reluctant, uneasy respect, tangled together with a growing dread I could not fully separate from it. Humanity had not raised a single weapon, had not issued a single threat, had not broken a single rule the Council itself had written. They had simply held up a mirror to exactly how much of their generosity we had taken for granted, and were now, calmly and deliberately, allowing us to see what remained once that generosity was withdrawn. I sought out Ambassador Whitmore directly during this period, an unusual step for someone in my administrative position, but I found myself unable to simply file these events into a folder and move on as I once might have. I requested a brief meeting through the proper channels, expecting to be turned away or ignored, given my relatively minor standing within the Council's hierarchy. To my surprise, she agreed to see me. Our conversation was brief, conducted in a small, sparsely furnished office within the human delegation's compound, a space that felt startlingly modest compared to the ornate chambers occupied by older, more established species. She listened patiently as I explained my role, my growing unease, and my genuine desire to understand what humanity intended going forward. Her answer was measured, careful, and entirely without malice, which somehow made it more unsettling than if she had expressed any anger at all. "We are not punishing anyone, Ordun," she said. "We are simply asking ourselves a question the Council answered for us when it ruled on Kesh Hollow. If our presence here is not valued enough to protect even a single system we were promised, we have to ask whether our continued presence here, in every quiet, unofficial way we have offered it, still makes sense for our own people. That is not an act of anger. It is simply an honest reassessment, conducted the same way we would conduct it for any other resource." I asked her, as carefully as I could, whether there was anything the Council could do to change the outcome of that reassessment. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "That would depend," she said finally, "on whether the Council is capable of recognizing what it actually lost, before the loss becomes permanent. I am not certain, given what I have observed these past 4 years, that recognition of that kind comes easily to this chamber." I left that meeting with no clear reassurance, only a deeper, more specific understanding of exactly how precarious the Council's position had become, and a growing, uncomfortable certainty that the Chamber's collective pride, the very quality that had allowed us to dismiss humanity so easily in the first place, might now be the single greatest obstacle standing between us and averting whatever consequences still lay ahead. The full withdrawal began without a single announcement, and that, more than anything else, is what made it so difficult for the Council to respond in time. I had expected, given everything building over the previous weeks, some kind of formal declaration, a final notice, marking the point, where humanity's careful, methodical review would conclude, and a clear decision would be delivered to the Chamber. Instead, the withdrawal simply continued, quietly expanding, system by system, until it became impossible to ignore, even for delegates who had spent weeks pretending the pattern did not exist. I first noticed the scale of it during a routine review of interstellar transit records, part of my regular archival duties. Human-owned or human-staffed vessels, which had for years made up a substantial portion of the traffic moving through several major trade corridors, had declined by nearly half within a single month. Cargo shipments that once moved reliably between border colonies now sat delayed at transfer stations, waiting for alternative carriers that simply did not exist in sufficient numbers to fill the gap. The Council's trade office, which I had rarely had reason to interact with directly, began requesting archival records from my office almost daily, trying to reconstruct exactly how dependent various supply chains had become on human logistics capacity. What they found, delegation by delegation, colony by colony, was sobering. In some border regions, human vessels had come to account for well over half of all essential supply movement, not because any treaty required it, but simply because human logistics networks had proven faster, more reliable, and more willing to service smaller, less profitable routes that older, more established trade guilds had long considered unprofitable to maintain. I remember a conversation with Laura Bennett, the infrastructure engineer I had spoken with weeks earlier, regarding the relay station decommissioning. She had, by this point, been reassigned to a broader crisis coordination task force, and she looked, when I found her in the infrastructure office late one evening, more exhausted than I had ever seen a member of my own species look. "We are trying to build replacement capacity for a network that took humans years to establish," she told me, without looking up from the schematics scattered across her desk. "We do not have years. Some of these colonies have perhaps a few months of buffered supply left before shortages become critical, and we cannot simply manufacture reliable transport capacity out of nothing." I asked her whether the Council had made any formal request to humanity to reconsider, or at least slow the pace of withdrawal to allow time for replacement systems to be built. She gave a short, humorless laugh before answering. "Several delegates have tried," she said. "The human delegation's response has been consistent every time. They are simply reallocating their own resources toward their own priorities, exactly as any Council member has every right to do. There is no treaty obligating them to maintain services they never formally agreed to provide. Legally, there is nothing to argue against. Morally, I suspect that is precisely the point they are making. I left her office that night with a growing, uncomfortable clarity, settling deeper into my thoughts. Humanity was not attacking us. They were not violating a single rule. They were simply choosing, deliberately and calmly, to stop propping up a system that had shown, through its own actions, exactly how little it valued their contribution. And the Council, having built so much of its daily function on the assumption that this quiet support would simply continue indefinitely, had no legal or procedural tool capable of compelling its return. The consequences, once they began appearing in earnest, arrived with startling speed. A border colony belonging to a species called the 11th Concord, which had relied heavily on human medical logistics during a prolonged public health crisis, reported a sharp increase in untreated illness within weeks of human medical teams withdrawing. The Council's own health office, understaffed and unprepared to absorb the sudden gap, struggled to coordinate a replacement response, delayed further by jurisdictional disputes over which member species should bear the cost of filling the void humanity had left behind. The reignited resource corridor dispute between the Threll Assembly and the Carvex Union, which I had watched unfold weeks earlier during that first emergency session, escalated further still. Without a trusted neutral party to mediate, both sides grew increasingly entrenched, each accusing the other of provocation, each refusing to back down for fear of appearing weak in the absence of any framework to guarantee the other side's good faith. The temporary rotating panel assigned to monitor the corridor proved, as Laura Bennett had predicted, wholly inadequate to the task. Reports of minor confrontations near the corridor's edge became a near-weekly occurrence. Perhaps most troubling to me personally, given my own role within the archive, was the quiet unraveling of several long-standing diplomatic relationships that had depended, more than anyone in the Council had previously acknowledged, on humanity's unique position as a species with no historical grievances against anyone. Two elder species, whose ancient rivalry had been carefully managed for years through human-mediated dialogue, found themselves suddenly without any trusted intermediary, willing or able to facilitate honest communication between them. Old suspicions, patiently managed for years, began resurfacing with a speed that suggested they had never truly been resolved at all, only quietly held in check by a presence neither side had fully appreciated until it was gone. I found myself, during this period, increasingly unable to view my own work with the same detached professionalism I once had. Filing archival records had always felt, to me, like a quiet, orderly task, a way of preserving order within a system I trusted to function correctly on its own. Now, each new notice I processed felt like documenting the slow, careful unraveling of something I had never fully understood the value of until it began coming apart. I raised these concerns again with Peter Lang, who had, by this point, become something closer to a genuine confidant than a simple supervisor. He listened to my growing list of concerns with the same careful attention he always offered, though I noticed, increasingly, a weariness settling into his own expression that had not been there weeks earlier. "I have served this archive for most of my adult life," he told me one evening, well after the rest of the office had emptied for the day. "I have watched species join and leave the Council. I have watched wars begin and end. I have never, in all that time, seen a member species withdraw its support so quietly, so completely within its rights, and so devastatingly effective, without ever once raising a weapon against anyone." I asked him whether he believed the Council could still recover from this, whether there remained some path toward repairing what had been damaged before the consequences became irreversible. He was quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before. "I believe," he said, "that it depends entirely on whether this chamber is capable of admitting fault before pride demands otherwise. And I have spent enough years watching this Council to know that admitting fault has never come easily to any of us, especially not to a species we spent 4 years convincing ourselves was beneath our serious consideration in the first place." That conversation stayed with me long after I returned home that night. I found myself, for the first time since the crisis began, genuinely afraid, not of humanity, who had done nothing throughout this entire unfolding crisis but quietly withdraw resources that had always, legally and morally, belonged to them alone, but of my own species, and of the deep, institutional pride that I feared might prevent us from recognizing the truth of our situation until far too much had already been lost to recover. I want to describe, as carefully and honestly as I can, exactly what the Council lost during those weeks, because I do not believe the full scale of it was ever properly understood by the Chamber until it was already too late to reverse. It began with logistics, but it did not end there. Once human transport capacity declined, the effects rippled outward in ways that even Laura Bennett's Crisis Coordination Task Force struggled to fully map. Colonies that had relied on human vessels for essential supply runs found themselves forced to negotiate new contracts with older trade guilds, most of whom, sensing sudden demand, raised prices well beyond what many smaller colonies could comfortably absorb. Disputes over these new arrangements began appearing before the Council's Trade Tribunal, at a pace the tribunal's small permanent staff could barely process. I found myself, during this period, assigned temporarily to assist the tribunal's overwhelmed archival team, cataloging an ever-growing backlog of trade disputes that had, only months earlier, been resolved quietly and efficiently through channels humanity had quietly maintained, without any formal recognition. The work was exhausting, and it gave me an unusually intimate view of exactly how many small, unglamorous processes across the Council had depended on humanity's quiet participation. I met, during this assignment, a data analyst named Nora Bishop, no relation to Owen Bishop from the earlier session, who had spent years working alongside human counterparts on the Council's disaster prediction models. She described to me, in careful detail, exactly how sophisticated those models had become under human collaboration, drawing on data collection and processing techniques that the Council's own analysts had never quite mastered on their own. We used to predict severe weather events on colonized worlds with enough accuracy to evacuate vulnerable populations days in advance, she told me, during a rare quiet moment between tribunal sessions. Since the human analysts withdrew, our predictions have become significantly less reliable. We missed an early warning on a storm system 3 weeks ago that displaced several thousand colonists on a border world before we even understood the severity of what was forming. Nobody was seriously hurt this time. I do not know how many more times we will be so fortunate. Her words settled into me with a particular weight, because they illustrated something I had begun to suspect, but had not yet seen so clearly demonstrated. Humanity's contributions had never simply been about convenience or efficiency. In many cases, they had represented a genuine safety margin, quietly protecting colonies and populations from consequences that the Council's own capabilities had never been sufficient to prevent on their own. The mediation gap, too, continued to widen in ways that troubled me deeply. The rotating panel overseeing the Threll and Carvex resource corridor dispute finally collapsed entirely after a particularly heated session in which both delegations accused the panel itself of favoring the other side. A complaint that, whatever its merit, illustrated exactly how much trust the panel had failed to establish, compared to the quiet, patient credibility Ambassador Whitmore's team had spent years carefully building. Without any functioning mediation structure, the corridor dispute escalated to the point where both delegations formally requested full Council intervention, a process that historically took months to organize properly, given the deliberative, consensus-driven nature of Council governance. I watched, from my position within the archive, as the Chamber debated procedural minutiae for days, while tensions along the actual corridor continued to simmer, unresolved and unmonitored, precisely the kind of situation Ambassador Whitmore's quiet, informal presence had once prevented from ever escalating this far in the first place. Perhaps the most quietly devastating loss, however, was one I did not fully appreciate until I encountered it directly through my own archival work. The Council's relationship with several smaller, newer member species, including Owen Bishop's own people, had depended significantly on human guidance during their early integration into Council governance. Humanity, having only recently gone through the same difficult process of learning Council procedure, protocol, and politics themselves, had developed an informal but remarkably effective practice of quietly mentoring newer species through the confusing early years of Council membership, offering guidance that older, more established species had rarely bothered to provide. With that guidance withdrawn, several newer species began making costly procedural errors that older delegations, whether through indifference or deliberate advantage, showed little inclination to correct. I reviewed, during my tribunal assignment, at least 3 separate cases where newer member species lost minor territorial or resource claims due to procedural missteps that, only months earlier, human advisors would likely have caught and corrected before any formal vote occurred. I raised this particular loss with Peter Lang, hoping he might offer some insight into how the council might address it. His response was more somber than I expected. "We built an entire system," he said, "that depended on one species choosing, entirely voluntarily, to smooth over every rough edge the rest of us were too proud, too indifferent, or too self-interested to address ourselves. We never once considered what would happen if that species simply decided the smoothing was no longer worth their effort. I am not certain we deserve, at this point, to be surprised by the answer." I asked him whether he believed there remained any path toward repairing the damage, and he offered an answer that has remained with me since, more than any other single exchange during this entire crisis. "Repair," he said, "requires more than simply asking humanity to return to old arrangements. It requires the Council to demonstrate, through genuine structural change, that their contributions will be valued and protected going forward, not merely tolerated as convenient until the next procedural technicality allows us to disregard them again. I do not know if this chamber, as currently constituted, is capable of that kind of change. Pride does not yield easily, even in the face of consequences this severe." That evening, reviewing the accumulated backlog of trade disputes, mediation failures, and procedural errors that had piled up across the Council in the span of only a few weeks, I found myself returning, again and again, to a single uncomfortable realization. We had spent 4 years treating humanity's quiet contributions as a permanent, guaranteed feature of Council life, something we were entitled to simply by virtue of their membership, rather than something they had chosen, freely and without obligation, to offer us out of genuine goodwill. That goodwill, I now understood with painful clarity, had never been unconditional. It had depended, all along, on whether the Council treated humanity as a valued partner or as a convenient, disposable resource. We had chosen, through countless small and large decisions, to treat them as the latter, and now, system by system, dispute by dispute, colony by colony, we were beginning to understand exactly what that choice had cost us. The Council's decision to send a delegation directly to human space did not come easily, and I only learned of my own inclusion in that delegation 2 days before departure, through a brief and somewhat startled notice from Peter Lang's office. I want to be honest about my reaction at the time. I did not feel prepared, nor particularly qualified, for a diplomatic mission of this significance. I was an archivist, not a negotiator, and my primary value to the delegation, as far as I could determine, lay simply in the depth of documentation I had accumulated over the preceding weeks, tracking the full scope of humanity's withdrawal and its cascading consequences across the Council. Peter Lang, it turned out, had personally recommended my inclusion, believing my careful records might prove useful in demonstrating, concretely and honestly, that at least some within the Council understood the true scale of what had been lost. The delegation itself was small, deliberately so, composed of representatives chosen more for their willingness to acknowledge difficult truths than for their seniority or political standing within the chamber. Nathan Cole, the delegate who had first publicly questioned the Human Mediation Office's absence during that early emergency session, led our small group. Laura Bennett accompanied us as well, given her direct knowledge of the infrastructure gaps humanity's withdrawal had created. I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, seated beside them during the long transit toward human space, reviewing my notes one final time, uncertain whether anything we brought with us would be enough to change what had already been set in motion. Human space, when we finally arrived, was nothing like the crowded, ornate council chambers I had spent my career within. The primary diplomatic reception facility we were guided toward was modest by comparison, functional rather than ceremonial, its design prioritizing clarity and efficiency over the elaborate displays of status that characterize so much of council architecture. I found myself, oddly, more unsettled by this simplicity than I would have been by any deliberate show of strength. Suggested a species entirely uninterested in impressing us, entirely secure in its own sense of purpose regardless of how the council chose to perceive them. Ambassador Whitmore received our delegation personally, along with a small group of her own senior staff. The meeting began with the same measured, careful courtesy I had encountered during my earlier private conversation with her, though this time the weight of the full council's failure hung visibly over the proceedings. Nathan Cole opened the discussion with what I understood, from our preparations during transit, to be a genuine and unrehearsed acknowledgement of fault. He described, in detail, the cascading failures that had followed humanity's withdrawal, the reignited hostilities along the resource corridor, the health crisis on the 11th Concord colony, the procedural losses suffered by newer member species who had depended on human guidance. He did not attempt to minimize any of it, nor did he attempt to frame it as anything other than a direct consequence of the Council's own dismissive treatment of humanity's contributions. Ambassador Whitmore listened to the entire account without interruption, her expression carefully neutral throughout. When Nathan Cole finished, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I appreciate the honesty of this account," she said finally. "It is more than I expected from this delegation, and more frankly, than the Council has offered us at any point during our 4 years of membership. But I want to be clear about something, because I do not believe it has been fully understood, even now. We did not withdraw our support to punish the Council. We withdrew it because the Council's own actions made clear, repeatedly and consistently, that our contributions were neither valued nor protected, and continuing to offer them under those conditions no longer made sense for our own people." Nathan Cole asked her directly what would be required to restore that sense of value and protection, to rebuild the kind of trust that might allow humanity to reconsider its withdrawal. Her answer, delivered without hesitation, has remained with me more clearly than almost anything else from that mission. "It would require more than an apology," she said. "It would require structural change, formal recognition, written into Council Charter, of the contributions member species make, beyond their strict treaty obligations, genuine protections against the kind of procedural technicalities that stripped us of Kesh Hollow in the first place. And most importantly, it would require the Council to demonstrate, through consistent future action, rather than a single corrective gesture, that this kind of dismissiveness will not simply resume once the immediate crisis has passed." I watched Nathan Cole absorb this answer, and I saw, in his expression, the particular difficulty of a delegate who understood the reasonableness of what was being asked, while simultaneously understanding how difficult it would be to convince the full council chamber to accept such sweeping structural change, particularly from older, more established species who had spent centuries operating under the very assumptions Ambassador Whitmore was now asking us to dismantle. I spoke only briefly during that meeting, offering my own archival records as evidence of the full scope of consequences the Council had already suffered, hoping the documentation might strengthen the case for structural change once we returned to present our findings to the full chamber. Ambassador Whitmore reviewed the records carefully, her expression unreadable, before finally addressing me directly for the first time since our earlier private conversation weeks before. "You have documented this more thoroughly than I expected," she said. "I recognize the effort this represents, and I do not dismiss it. But documentation alone will not repair what has already broken. It will only tell you, clearly and honestly, exactly how much was lost, and exactly how much further there is still to fall, if the pattern is allowed to continue." Our delegation departed human space without any firm commitment from Ambassador Whitmore regarding humanity's willingness to reconsider its withdrawal. She had made clear, throughout our discussion, that any change in humanity's position would depend entirely on the Council's willingness to enact genuine structural reform, not simply offer apologies or temporary corrective measures designed to placate immediate concerns while leaving the underlying dynamics unchanged. The return transit felt considerably longer than the journey out had been. I spent much of it in quiet conversation with Laura Bennett and Nathan Cole, all three of us uncertain whether the full council chamber, given its historical resistance to structural change and its deeply ingrained institutional pride, would prove capable of enacting the kind of reform Ambassador Whitmore had described. Nathan Cole, normally measured and careful in his assessments, offered a rare moment of unguarded honesty during that return journey that has stayed with me since. "I have served in this chamber for many years," he said, staring out at the passing starfield rather than at either of us. "I have watched species argue over the smallest procedural details for decades. refusing to yield an inch even when the underlying issue barely mattered. I do not know if this chamber, faced with a crisis this severe, is capable of the kind of humility genuine structural reform would require. I want to believe it is. I am not certain that belief is warranted. I did not have a confident answer to offer him, and neither did Laura Bennett. We simply sat together, quietly, watching the stars pass, uncertain whether we were returning home with the beginning of a genuine solution, or simply confirming, through our own failed mission, exactly how far the damage had already spread, beyond any easy repair. Years have passed since that delegation returned from human space, and I find myself, now in a far more senior position within the archive than I ever expected to hold, still returning to those weeks in my thoughts more often than almost any other period of my long career. The Council did, eventually, enact a version of the structural reforms Ambassador Whitmore had described, though it took far longer than any of us on that delegation had hoped, and the version that finally passed was, in many ways, a diminished compromise compared to what she had originally outlined. Formal recognition was written into Council Charter for contributions made beyond strict treaty obligation, though the protections attached to that recognition proved weaker than many of us had argued for, softened repeatedly by older delegations reluctant to surrender the procedural flexibility that had allowed situations like Kesh Hollow to occur in the first place. Humanity's response to these reforms was measured, cautious, and notably restrained. Some elements of their withdrawal were quietly reversed. Limited mediation services resumed for a small number of the most severe disputes, including, eventually, the resource corridor between the Threll Assembly and the Carvex Union, though the trust that Ambassador Whitmore's team had once built over years took considerably longer to rebuild than it had taken to lose. Human relay stations in a handful of critical border regions were recommissioned, though many others remained permanently decommissioned, their maintenance quietly absorbed, imperfectly and at considerable cost, by Council infrastructure offices that had never fully replaced the efficiency humanity's original network had provided. But much of what had been lost during those weeks was never fully restored. The mentorship relationships that had once quietly guided newer member species through the confusing early years of Council integration never returned to their previous scope. Owen Bishop's own people, and several other newer species who had once benefited from that quiet guidance, were left to navigate Council procedure largely on their own, a task that continued, in the years since, to cost them more than any of us in the archive ever fully documented. I have often reflected, during the quieter moments of my continuing career, on what exactly the Council lost during that period, and I have come to believe it was never simply a matter of logistics networks, or mediation services, or relay stations, though all of those losses were real, and their consequences continue to ripple outward, even now. What the Council truly lost, I believe, was something far harder to rebuild than any single piece of infrastructure. We lost the presence of a species that had asked for remarkably little in return for the considerable goodwill they extended to us, and we lost it, not because of any hostile act on their part, but because we ourselves demonstrated, repeatedly and without hesitation, exactly how little we valued that goodwill until the moment it was withdrawn. I think often, too, of Ambassador Whitmore's original words, spoken so long ago during humanity's initial entry proceedings, words that had once been dismissed by the entire chamber as a simple diplomatic pleasantry. We only intend to be useful for as long as being useful makes sense to us. I understand now, with a clarity that took years of consequence to fully develop, that this sentence had never been a threat, nor even truly a warning in the way I once believed. It had simply been an honest statement of principle, offered freely to a chamber too confident in its own permanence to take it seriously. Humanity never raised a weapon against the Council. They never violated a single treaty, never broke a single rule we ourselves had written. They simply, quietly, and entirely within their rights, chose to stop extending goodwill to an institution that had shown them, again and again, exactly how disposable that goodwill was considered to be, and in doing so, they revealed something about the Council that I do not believe any of us fully understood until it was too late to easily repair. We had built an entire structure of daily function, of quiet peace, of steady logistics and careful mediation, on the assumption that generosity, once given, would simply continue indefinitely, regardless of how carelessly it was treated. Humanity taught us, through nothing more than their own quiet, principled withdrawal, exactly how mistaken that assumption had always been. I still hold my position within the archive, though I have grown considerably more careful, in the years since, about which contributions I choose to take for granted, and which I make certain to formally recognize and protect, regardless of whether the species offering them ever demands such recognition themselves. I owe that particular lesson, along with a great many others, to a small, unassuming human delegation that never once raised its voice, never once threatened retaliation, and never once asked for anything beyond the simple courtesy of being valued for what they freely chose to give. The seats once reserved for the human delegation in the outer ring of the council chamber remain, even now, only partially filled, a quiet, permanent reminder of exactly how much trust was lost during those weeks, and exactly how long it may yet take, if it can ever be fully accomplished at all, to earn it back. I do not know if the council, as an institution, will ever fully understand the weight of what we allowed to walk quietly out the door. But I understand it now, clearly and completely, every single time I look toward those still empty seats, and remember exactly how it felt to watch a species leave without saying a single word, and to realize, far too late, exactly what that silence had always meant.